Good morning, everyone. If you'd like to turn your Bibles once again to the book of First Timothy. First Timothy. We're going to be in First Timothy chapter 3 this morning. Glad to be here with you all today. I'm looking forward to the young men presenting this morning, conducting the service. I think it's going to be really edifying for all of us. And speaking of young men, we're going to be talking about this letter to Timothy this morning. So I think we see a lot of the characteristics we see in Timothy and our young men. So I'm really looking forward to their what they've got put together this morning. So 1 Timothy chapter 3, whenever we have to have I shouldn't put it that way. Whenever we have a lesson on elders, whenever we're looking to put elders in place, or looking to appoint new elders, we always come to 1 Timothy chapter 3. That's generally our starting point. We'll also go to Titus. We'll look at some other places. But 1 Timothy chapter 3 is kind of the bread and butter of the elder lesson. And rightly so. Rightly so. This is where we get a bulk of the teaching on what type of men should be appointed as elders, what type of men we should be looking for to lead in the Lord's church. But many times when we have those lessons, they kind of read like a shopping list, right? Like we're going to have the lesson. We're going to look at the list of requirements in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and Titus and other places, and then we're just going to start checking off requirements. If we just do it that way, if we're not looking at the bigger picture of who elders are and what elders are meant to do, then we're going to be missing out on a lot. So this morning, as we look through 1 Timothy chapter 3, talking about elders and also talking about deacons, and considering what these, I'm just going to use the general term offices because I don't have a better word for it. What these offices are supposed to do and to be in terms of the bigger picture. Let's try to keep that bigger picture in mind as we look through these and then see why, first of all, there are so many requirements. And secondly, how those requirements contribute to that work. So I'm kind of stepping on my own toes this morning. Sorry, turn this on here. There we go. Okay, so what is an elder? What is some of yours might say an overseer? So we have multiple words used for this office. Overseer, elder, bishop, shepherd, pastor. The different translations of your New Testament may have many of those words here, but also used in other places. And so when we're talking about elders in the Lord's church, all of these terms can be used synonymously. They are not different things. Now, within the religious world today at large, the words bishop, primarily the words bishop and pastor may have some sort of other meaning. For instance, a bishop within the Catholic Church is an individual that is appointed over many churches. He's appointed over a diocese. And so then he is not one individual within one congregation performing one function. He is an overseer of many congregations and the one who they all report to. Similarly, within much of the religious world, the word pastor has come to take a meaning of the preacher, the evangelist. And that's not how that word is used within the New Testament. The evangelist and the pastor are two separate things, and they're not conflated with one another. Now, an evangelist can be a pastor and vice versa, but they are not necessarily the same thing. So when we see these terms, and again, depending on how they might be translated within your version of the Bible that you're using, These terms are all synonymous for this office, for what we're going to talk about today. Okay, and so that word then is the word we translate it episkopos, or from the Greek episkeptomai. Okay, now I've tried not to go into too many Greek studies in this particular look at this book, but I do think that this one is interesting in terms of, again, looking at the bigger picture of what these individuals are supposed to do and how it contributes both to the work of the church at large and the work that Paul is calling Timothy to do within this church at Ephesus. Okay, so this word meaning to visit or to look intently at. Okay, so that's generally really where we get the word overseer from. This is one who oversees. And so this word visiting or looking intently. Now we use the word visiting not in the sense of somebody comes over to visit for tea time. Somebody comes over to visit to chat. Visit has a much more in-depth meaning than that. For instance, when you say you're going to visit the sick, you're not just going to pop up at the front door and knock on it and say hello. Your intent when you go to visit the sick, what are you planning to do? What should be the intent there? If you're visiting the sick, what's your intent? To help their needs, okay? And to alleviate any suffering that they might be experiencing in whatever way that you can. So there's more action involved in that rather than just kind of a momentary type of visit. That's where the second part goes into, to look intently. Let's again use the sick example. If you're going over to someone's house because you know that they haven't felt well and you haven't seen them in a couple of days, you want to look intently into what their situation is at that given moment. How are they feeling? What is their condition? What is their emotional state? What is the state of their surroundings or their environment? And so your intent then is to go and find out those things, to investigate, not in any sort of intrusive way, but to investigate so that you can use whatever skills or talents you have to make that situation better. Okay, so that's really what's involved in this word. Now, obviously, we don't have Greek in the Old Testament, but the Septuagint version, the Greek version of the Old Testament, uses this particular word in places like Genesis chapter 50, verses 24 and 25. Okay, when Joseph is about to die, or when Jacob is about to die, and the children of Israel have gone, or the children of Jacob have gone down into Egypt. I tell you what, let's just read the passage. Genesis chapter 50. Genesis chapter 50. Sometimes you're better off just reading than trying to explain. Genesis chapter 50, verses 24 and 25. Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will certainly come to your aid and bring you up from this land to the land he promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So Joseph made the Israelites take an oath. When God comes to your aid, you are to carry my bones up from here. Now, my translation has rendered this comes to your aid. What are some of the other translations on this? What? Visit. Okay, so God will certainly visit you and bring you up from this land to the land he promised Isaac, Abraham, and Jacob. Now, what is God's purpose in visiting them? I mean, he says it right here, but what's the purpose? Is it just to make an appearance? What is the purpose of the visitation? To come to their aid and to bring about his purpose for them, right? Okay, so God is visiting them for their good in order to further that purpose. And so then just a couple of pages over in Exodus chapter 3, couple of hundred years later, the children of Israel, children of Jacob, are down in Egypt. And we know, as we have read the story, that a new Pharaoh came into power that did not know or respect God. And he enslaved that family down there in Egypt. And so God speaks to Moses to let him know what's about to happen and how he's going to intervene on behalf of his people. And in Exodus chapter 3, verses 16 and 17, God tells Moses, "Go and assemble the elders of Israel and say to them, Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has appeared to me and said, I have paid close attention to you and to what has been done to you in Egypt. And I have promised you that I will bring you up from the misery of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey." In verse 16, that phrase, "I have paid close attention," same word. I have come to visit you. I'm visiting you in order to bring you up from the misery that you are in. Okay? Now, in terms of elders, kind of looking at the bigger purpose here, I don't want to give the impression that elders are only involved in the alleviation of physical suffering. That's not primarily or only what they're about. Now, we do know in the book of James, the elders visiting is prescribed in terms of physical ailment. However, that's not the only purpose. It is, however, for an individual to look into the situation of another in order to make it better or fulfill a purpose. And so then when we get to the New Testament, and again, mentioning the book of James here, James chapter 1 and verse 27, one of the verses within James that we're probably most familiar with, he says, "True Christianity is this, to visit widows and orphans in their distress." Same word, episkopos. Okay, so they're being used of all Christians. So this is not just an elder's responsibility. This is the responsibility of all those in the Lord's church. But again, that word there, when we're visiting widows and orphans, it is not just to ask how you're doing. It is to take action in order to alleviate suffering or betterment of that individual. So then we ask the question, with these in mind, with these concepts, kind of larger concepts in mind, first of all, how might these other uses that we just talked about of this term help us to understand the purpose of elders? What is the point? Well, we have men here who are called out, who are appointed in order to lead in this task. We just said, according to James 1:27, visiting the widows and orphans, those in distress, is the responsibility of all Christians. However, the elders are the prime examples of doing this. The elders are the one that take a position of leadership in doing things like this. And so then we ask then the second question, how do these concepts help us to understand the need for elders in the circumstances surrounding this letter? Okay? We haven't really talked about sick people in this letter. We haven't really talked about those who are in financial distress or, really under types of persecution or things like that. Really, what we have talked about is the church coming under distress because of false teaching and things like that. So when we consider this visiting and looking intently into something, those that are overseeing the church, what do you think is the purpose in relation to the situation that we're dealing with here in Ephesus? So let me kind of put that out there to you. Why does Paul, it almost seems like he switches gears here in chapter 3, right? Like we just got done talking about instructions to men and women based on the example of Jesus and the example of Paul. And then we switch over and all of a sudden we're talking about elders and deacons. So looking at the situation in Ephesus with false doctrine being taught, people seeking positions of power or influence for themselves, Why is Paul talking about elders here and listing these qualifications? Why do you think? Let's kind of get some thought on that. Mike.
Well, I think this may be where the word shepherd goes back.
Okay.
You think about, shepherd looking intently or looking after his flock. It's really for the protection and the care. And so in this situation, or any situation where you false teaching, these type of men would be looking after and looking intently after what's going on there to protect the congregation from false teaching.
Okay. All right. So primarily then here in this situation, taking a protector role or a corrective role even. So yes, I think that's great. Anything else on that, Eddie?
Now think about the time where we know the timing of when elders were appointed. We see it in the first missionary journey when Barnabas and Paul had gone through Central Asia, kind of turn around, backtrack, and emphasize the fact that they appointed elders in every church. So here's a situation where the apostles are leading. And it's essentially appointing men who will do a portion of the work that the apostles were doing when they were there with the church. In this case, we know that Paul has left Ephesus, he left Timothy there, but for the purpose of setting things in order, and part of setting things in order is to appoint men who will watch over this church.
Okay. All right. So not only taking action when action is necessary, but also looking out. And that goes back to that shepherd aspect that Mike was talking about. Brett.
Not just
Yes. Yeah, you don't want a manager of a business who's there only to take care of problems that arise. You want somebody that is a good steward of the things that you've entrusted to them. Keep your thumb there for just a second and look at Ephesians chapter 4. Ephesians chapter 4. Eddie mentioned this just a second ago, and it made me think of this, that here we are at a time when the apostles can't, first of all, the apostles that are still alive at this time can't be everywhere at once. But also, the apostles are increasingly not alive anymore. There aren't any more apostles, or won't be at any given time. And so there has to be something in place for that. Now we see elders throughout the Bible. So I don't want to make it seem like this is a cobbled together plan because once we run out of apostles, then we got to have something else. I think this was always God's plan to have these types of individuals amongst his community. And we can see that even in the children of Israel as they develop into a nation in the wilderness. But in Ephesians chapter 4, you notice in verse 4, he gives this series of ones. There's one body, one spirit, as you were called to one hope at your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is above all and through all and in all. And so the thrust of this particular chapter in Ephesians is trending towards unity in the faith. Okay? And so he says in verse 11 of that same chapter, and he personally gave some to be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors and teachers. So there's our word there, pastors. Some pastors and teachers, or elders and teachers, for, verse 12, what's the reason? The training of the saints in the work of ministry to build up the body of Christ until we all reach unity in the faith and the knowledge of God's Son, growing into a mature man with a stature measured by Christ's fullness. And so we have a series of, again, I'm just going to use the word offices here, types of roles might be a better word to use there. We have a series of roles here, some of which will not be in existence in our setting today. There are no more apostles. We don't have anyone who's seen Jesus and has been with Jesus, seen the risen Jesus. And has been directly tasked with going from church to church. To a degree, we don't have prophets. We are speaking the prophetic word that has been handed to us, but there are really no more prophets. And that's another study for another day. However, he does say some evangelists, some pastors and teachers, and all of this is for the training of the saints to build us all up in unity so that we all look like Christ. So elders then, in this context, and keep in mind, this is the Ephesian letter, same church we're talking to in 1 Timothy. These individuals play a role in that process of unifying us, teaching us, and helping us to grow into maturity until we reach a stature measured by Christ. So these individuals are vital to this task. And as we're talking about this morning, they help take a leadership role in that. They are both prime examples and men who have experience and wisdom in order to help us get to the goal that we need to. And so when we're looking at problems within the Ephesian church, problems of false doctrine, problems of division because people are putting their status above other people, women are dressing in ways that set themselves apart physically on purpose, so that they might have a higher stature or better social standing than others. Elders play a role against that, in combating that and correcting that and helping us to see what we truly can be. Any other comments on these questions before we move into the descriptions at large? Mike?
Kind of thinking out loud, but something I've heard people say, this is like online, people put complaints about the way churches are run, there's a complaint out there about elders who run churches like businesses instead of like churches. And it sounds good, but I've never really been quite, I feel like we're onto something, but I'm not quite sure what that means, what that looks like. And as we're talking about this, I kind of got that turned around in my head. And it seems like there's maybe a tendency when you have someone who is leading a congregation for their, to think of their focus as to be, I'm not sure the right word, kind of scheduling, kind of settling differences, like the role of the elder is decide what time we're going to meet. And since someone half the congregation wants the building to be white and half wants it to be wood, and the elders are the ones who will make the decision, and the focus of eldership comes on being the arbiters of policy, decisions, and scheduling, and all those things.
Yes.
But the focus here is really more not on that stuff, but on the Christians themselves and seeing to their needs, both physical and spiritual. And it's certainly leadership, but it's not just, it's not, it really, I kind of see what they're, I think I see what they're getting at when they say not like a manager.
Right.
Really, you're not making out the schedule, filling out signing time cards, but you're seeing to the needs of the people that you're over.
Yes. Yeah. It is difficult not to see a tension there sometimes, right? Because you don't want to relegate them to just making executive decisions. And more so want to, again, keep that bigger picture in mind of what they're appointed to do and how that's carried out. And I think that's generally where we get into that mindset of them more as kind of business managers. Is we see these roles and we see the types of men that are supposed to carry out these roles, but we're not 100% sure exactly how they're supposed to carry out the role. Like, what is their function as a leader and how far does that function extend? Now we do see, and I don't want to rabbit trail on this too much, but we do see instances where there is an issue within a church or there is a situation that needs to be addressed, and we see the whole congregation come together to make a decision about something. And that may be a congregation that has elders. Now, what then is the elder's responsibility in a situation like that? Do they just get the consensus of the congregation and then go ahead and make a decision? Is it up to them to make a decision, or is it the congregation at large? And those are things that we have to work through. I would like to say I have an answer for every single one of those types of situations, but I don't. However, what I do know is that when we are looking for wisdom and guidance in making that decision, however we're doing it, the elders should be among the first examples, first sources of wisdom whom we would go to for guidance on how to carry that out. Does that make sense?
Congregation. And I'm thinking one of the reasons why I've had trouble getting my handle on what they're talking about, not really like a business, is like some of the people I've been saying that I think their agenda is to kind of take the leadership powers away from elders. And I don't want to see elders lose their authority.
Right.
But I don't want having authority to become their only function.
Right.
Because clearly they are supposed to have that authority in service to the benefit of the needs of the congregation.
Right.
That has to be the goal. The method may vary, but you always have to be able, I can say, you know, I'm kind of thinking out here, but it seems like you always have to say, we as elders are doing this because it's good for Christians.
Yes.
And, you know, they have to be able to honestly say, that's the reason they made it. They're trying.
Yeah.
They're not just trying, well, it's simply kind of makes you make one. The mindset, I guess it needs to be, we're doing this to help the church and help the individual Christians.
Yeah. Yeah. It's even harder to think about this in these terms in an election year, isn't it? Yeah. Well, maybe as we get into some of the characteristics, hopefully they will lend to helping to answer that question and helping us to think about what they do and how they operate. Eddie.
People think about Hebrews 13,
Mhm.
where Paul doesn't use the word elder, but he does say obey your leaders.
Yes.
But then he emphasizes, where they keep watch over your soul. Now, I'm not trying to say that it limits it only to the soul.
Right.
But that is their primary focus.
Yes.
And when you compare that with Acts 6, where the apostles saw there was racism in the way that the widows were being taken care of.
Right.
Said it's not desirable for us to neglect the word, wait on tables, but we do need to make sure this is done properly and fairly.
Right.
And so I think that's a great example of where they provide a spiritual leadership
Mm-hmm.
while not getting involved in the day-to-day operations of these physical needs.
Right. Right. And there will be individuals to whom that specific task is delegated, which we will get to here in the chapter. Okay, very good discussion. Let's jump into these so that we have time to cover them. All right. So he mentions at the very outset of 1 Timothy 3 here, going back to our book, he says, this saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to be an overseer or elder, he desires a noble work. Okay, so let's just kind of look at this for just 1 second. Looking at, thinking about kind of what we just talked about, thinking about God looking after, tending to his people in the wilderness and tending to their growth and their betterment as they grow into his nation. Thinking about Christians today and how we are to look out for one another and take care of one another. So he says here, if anyone aspires, you know, what does the word aspire mean? That's kind of a lofty word. When we say somebody aspires to something, what's the idea there? Okay, yeah. So when I think of the word aspire, it almost kind of has this elevated sense to it, right? If I'm aspiring to something, I'm looking up towards that thing. I'm building towards it or moving upwards towards that goal. If I aspire to something, I'm not generally looking to wallow in the mud or get into something, you know, filthy, something like that. I'm looking to something greater. I'm reaching upward to that thing. So if someone aspires to this or has an inclination, and so much of an inclination that they adjust things and that their mindset is constantly looking forward to that thing. It says he does, if anyone aspires to be an overseer, he desires a noble work. So aspire and desire, there's your rhyming for the morning. Okay, so reaching after, and then that desire implies a strong passion or yearning. This word for desire is used in both the positive and the negative aspects within the New Testament. We could be talking about desire in terms of sexual desire. We could be talking about desire in terms of power or money or influence. We could also be talking about desire as in Jesus desired to eat the Passover meal with his disciples. So same word there. It's this strong inclination or yearning for something. And so it says then, if any man aspires to this role, he desires a noble work. This is a noble task to which he has been thinking about. Now contrast that with what we talked about in chapter 1, with these teachers who are teaching the law and they don't know what they're talking about. What presumably is the reasoning that they want to be teachers of the law? They want influence and power. They want to be first and foremost among the individuals in this particular group. That's right. So it's all about them. So then why is it that Paul says if somebody wants to be an elder, an overseer, why is this a noble work? Okay, so someone seeking this leadership role in the congregation, it is not bad for them to want to be a leader amongst the group. I think that's really what Paul is getting at. To aspire to this office is not a bad thing, it's a noble thing. However, your reasoning for aspiring to it, that's what comes into play. Eddie.
I think this is why some people make a really big deal out of the fact that the word office is not found in the original.
Right, yeah.
Because what Paul was really telling Timothy, does someone aspire to do this work?
Mm-hmm.
Not aspire to hold a position.
Yep.
But aspire to do this work. And that I think is the difference in the motive that you talked about in comparison to chapter 1.
Yes. Yeah. So if we're talking to a younger man and we ask him about his future plans and he says, I want to be an elder in the church. You're not going to say like, oh, well, somebody thinks highly of themselves, don't they? No, they want to position themselves throughout their life. They want to have an attitude. They want to have the wisdom and develop into an individual that can take this role. And Paul says that is a noble task. It is good for them to think that way. Okay? Because the type of individual that he's getting ready to outline is the type of person that should be in that role if he has these characteristics. Okay? So again, thinking back to chapter 1 and verse 5, in contrast to those teachers who are seeking position or prestige or any of those things, chapter 1 and verse 5, he says the goal of our instruction, that is the apostles and those that are associated, the goal of our instruction is love from a pure heart, a good conscience, and a sincere faith. And so you contrast those two ideas together, and we see why Paul mentions this here, why this falls at this point in the letter, and what he's trying to get across here. So when we look at this again, I don't want to think of these characteristics as a shopping list. However, I want to think of them as making a composite portrait of an individual. And I was trying to think through this. So the last time I did this, I separated out all the colors of a picture. And as we went through each characteristic, we added the colors, and then we came out with a full color portrait at the end. And I was trying to use that as an illustration of this point. However, also think about this in maybe the negative as well. If any one part of this is missing, then the picture is incomplete. Have you ever, this may be a niche question, but maybe I'll ask this of David. Have you ever been messing around on Photoshop with a photo and you get into like the settings, you get into the brightness settings and the contrast and the tint and all those types of things, and you get to messing with them. Okay, you can easily do this on an iPhone. I know I'm getting way too technical here, but I'm making a point. You get to messing with the settings of the photo, okay? And you're like, oh yeah, that looks really good. I'm all the way up to 100. I don't want that one so much. I'm gonna take that one all the way down to 0. And then by the time you get done messing with the settings, the photo looks terrible. I mean, it's either gone, it's either washed out, or the colors are way too vivid, or all the blacks are just way too black, and then you can tap on it and see the original versus the what you've created, and it just doesn't even compare. Okay, so that's what I liken this to. Paul is giving us a series of these characteristics, and all of them work in concert together to create or to kind of point out this individual. And they work together in the life of a man who has carefully and intentionally patterned his life after Jesus. I think when we look at these characteristics, we cannot say that anyone just kind of falls into these characteristics. They are intentional characteristics. They have to be cultivated and they have to be developed over time. Okay? So despite the fact that Paul characterizes each of these as a must, if we simply view this as a shopping list to fill an office, we're going to miss the point. However, to leave any one of these characteristics out means that we're missing part of the picture. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. So with that in mind, let's dive right into some of these characteristics. And we don't have to go into depth into all of these. We don't have time for it. And I think some of these are fairly self-explanatory. So I've tried to put up different, I know that text is a little bit small, but I've tried to include different translations of how these words are rendered, because I do think some get the meaning across a little bit better. For instance, some translations will give the first characteristic of a man who is blameless. Others will say above reproach. Now, can any one of us in the cosmic sense, in the grand picture of things, say that we are blameless in all aspects of our life? Absolutely not. No, none of us can be considered 100% blameless. There's only one individual that gets that tag. Okay? So is that what we're talking about? Are we talking about an individual that has never made a mistake, that has never intentionally sinned, that has never done any of those things? No, that's not what we're talking about. However, he has a reputation of being above reproach. Here's an individual that when he is out amongst the world, people can say, I disagree with his position. I don't agree with his morality. I don't agree with any, his sense of right and wrong and those types of things. However, in his conduct and in his character and his reputation, I got nothing against it. I don't have anything. I think, not to get into the political realm, but I do think of it an individual, Mike Pence, our former vice president, okay, a couple of years ago. Whatever your thoughts are on Mike Pence, I think he's a good guy. I think he's an upstanding guy. And there was a point at which he gave a comment to somebody that he intentionally did not put himself in a situation where he was alone with a member of the opposite sex, in order that he could not be accused in any way of ever doing something untoward or inappropriate. Okay? He was intentionally keeping himself above reproach. Now, ironically, he found himself in many news media outlets the subject of reproach because of his position. But that didn't have anything to do with the concept itself. It had to do with people's, whether or not they liked him or their political ideology. And so here is a guy who you can look at him and you can look at his life, how he treats his wife, how he respects his family, how he fulfills his office, and whether or not you agree with how he did that, if he did too much, did too little, any of those things, I think we can agree that he is an individual that, for the most part, just from our kind of outside perspective, is a person who is above reproach. He doesn't have anything sticking to him. Eddie.
You mentioned earlier the idea that, well, you got it up there, leaders who lead like Jesus.
Yes.
I think of Jesus before Pilate, where the Jews are accusing him of every crime that you
Yes.
could possibly imagine. And Pilate is saying, no, he's not guilty. No,
Yeah.
that's not true. He's not guilty. Pilate recognized
Right.
just simply by his character, these things aren't true.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, and you thank you for calling me back to this. I do have the title up there, Leaders Who Lead Like Jesus. In every one of these characteristics, and I meant to make this point when I was looking at the portrait example, but I got caught up in my own illustration. All of these characteristics, to a degree, describe Jesus. Now, wait, give me some leeway before we get to husband of one wife and all of those things. There is a point there. But all of these characteristics, to a degree, describe Jesus, right? So we're looking at men who give a portrait, a pattern of Jesus, all right? And so when we look at someone who is above reproach, Eddie gives a great example of Jesus being before Pilate. Although they were leveling all of these false accusations against him, they could look at him and say, I mean, this doesn't really track. So that's a good example. All right, so now we get to then this second. Oh, sorry, Mike. Yeah.
And he'll find something, and then he'll go away for 3 months to find himself, and then they bring him back and they say he's been restored.
Yeah.
The people will complain and say, well, wait a minute, look what he did. And then, but then it's put off on me and say, but he's been forgiven. He's repented. God has forgiven him. So you have to forgive him.
Yeah.
But that's not the issue. It's not about being forgiven, because then anybody can be forgiven.
Right.
It's about being above reproach. Even though they're forgiven of that sin, it's something which is going to impact their ability to believe.
Yes.
Innocent.
Yeah. Yeah, and there is some wisdom to be used in that, I think. There is some nuance to be used in that particular type of situation. I think you're right there. You know, to rush back into that just to say, we like this guy, we want to put him back into a position of authority because he's a nice guy and he's really influential, that is a false premise. However, to say that someone has committed a sin, and something we might even categorize as a serious sin, and then to never be qualified again, I think is also a fallacy. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Now, there are certain situations that can disqualify us, I think fairly permanently. However, we'll get to those. We're going to run out of time here. I want to get to this. That's a very good point. The husband of one wife, and we say, well, Jesus wasn't married, so how can this be an example of Jesus? Okay. Well, is there any point in Scripture at which Jesus is referred to as a groom? How so? Okay. All right. In terms of the church, right? The church is the bride of Christ. And so he is the groom. And so how does Jesus act in relation to the church when thinking of it in this way? Okay. I mean, you could go back to the Old Testament, right? Think about Hosea, that God is characterizing himself with loving kindness. And all of that is done through the example of Hosea and his wife, who is unfaithful. Okay, so faithfulness is the key. Fidelity is the key there. And so an elder then, as Jesus is constantly faithful to the church in all situations, an elder is a man who is faithful to the church that he is overseeing, that he is invested in it to the point at which he will sacrifice for it, just as a husband should do for his wife. Now, we also look at this and this kind of precludes that this is a man in this office. These terms are very specific. The husband of one wife. Now, in the Greek, it does say a one-man woman. That's really the literal translation of this. But this is the idea that he is the husband of one wife. He is faithful and has fidelity to one individual. Okay? So someone who is, and we'll kind of put some of these together, who is self-controlled or temperate, someone who has control over his emotions, over his thoughts, over his actions, someone who is respectable and someone who is sensible, who is sober-minded, who doesn't think of everything as a joke, who isn't cynical in their outlook. You ever talk to people like that every time you talk to them, it looks like they have kind of a cynical, irreverent view of the world. And so you're never sure if your conversation with them is genuine or so this is a person that is sober-minded. They can set their mind on the task at hand with the gravity that it deserves. So that's the idea there. someone who is respectable. And the idea there is in terms of behavior. The way that they act among people and their general behavior is one that is worthy of respect amongst the community. Hospitable is a big one. When we say hospitable, what generally do we think of when we think of hospitality? What's kind of our general, what do we usually think of when we think in terms of being hospitable? Southern comfort, right? Yeah, you're gonna have people into your house, you're gonna have a potluck, or you're gonna, have a casserole for somebody. That's hospitable. Is that the only thing that's being talked about through this term? What does he mean by hospitable then?
Love a neighbor.
To love a neighbor. Okay, Mike?
Me, I feel like it be approachable, somebody that you always have the demeanor that people can come to you.
Okay.
Think about that role of the elder.
Yep.
People need to be able to come. Express concern.
Right. Yeah. So there's the difference between leaders who lead by edict and by, just iron will, and then leaders who have a genuine care that you can see within their character. Loving a stranger. Okay. How
Which has a great meaning actually, because it really isn't talking about inviting my best friend to come have dinner with me.
yes.
This is someone who I don't know.
Yes.
This is the Good Samaritan.
The good, I was just about to say that exact same thing. You could go primarily to the parable of the Good Samaritan and think about what does hospitality mean. That's not the only thing being talked about in that parable. However, it is the driving force behind what Jesus is trying to get across to the crowds that he's talking to. Okay, we've run out of time. I talked us to death this morning. So we're going to pick up here next time and go through the rest of these, and then we'll talk about deacons and then kind of the role of the church at large that Paul is trying to get across. So thank you for your comments this morning. Thank you so much.